Okay, so we are covering 3 chapters in this unit, chapter 19, 20, and 21. So we got quite a bit to do. We're going to start with chapter 19, which is looking at civil liberties and basically looking at the First Amendment freedoms that are included in the First Amendment. So we are going to start with the freedom of religion. And the freedom of religion covers a couple of different things. The first it covers is establishment. And establishment is the relationship between the church and the state. We're going to look at several cases that involve that. The second thing that it covers is free exercise. And free exercise is an individual's right to pursue religion and to adopt a faith, I guess. But your right to pursue or not to pursue a religion. So, like I said, we're going to look at several court cases or rulings that have dealt with both of those things. And the first one we're going to look at is the Establishment Clause. And like I said, that's the relationship between the church and the state. And you've probably heard this phrase more than once in the course of your high school career, but the separation of church and state. And so we've had several court cases that have come about that have defined what that means. How does it come down, and how does that play in the separation of church and state? So, 1948, we have a court case called McCollum versus the Board of Education, which talks about released time programs. And released time programs is basically like church night for schools. It allows public schools to release students from school time in order to attend religious classes. So that's why we can't have practice after 6 o'clock, because that would allow you free up your night to go to your religious classes when you need to. So that's what that comes from. Another court case, or I guess other court cases, I don't have one in specific, but other court cases deal with prayers and the Bible in schools. And it has been found to be unconstitutional to post the 10 Commandments, to require moments of silence, to give prayers during graduation, and schools cannot sponsor religious exercises. Now, I know the question is going to come up about prayers during graduation. Well, you can have a prayer as long as it is non-denominational. So it has to be very, very generic and not offensive to any religion, basically. So that's what it kind of boils down to. So, just as you guys are graduating, make sure that you're careful with what prayer you're giving, that you're not going to be offending people of any other faith in the audience. So that's basically what it comes down to. Moments of silence, we cannot require moments of silence. We can offer moments of silence, but a school cannot require you to observe it, kind of thing. It's imposing a religious faith or a religious ideal onto others. Another thing that comes from the First Amendment deals with student religious organizations or student religious groups. It's called the Equal Access Act. And this Equal Access Act says that student religious groups get the same as any other group in school. So things like FCA, which is the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, would get equal access to using school property, to using school time, should it need it, being able to put up posters, that kind of thing, in order to accommodate people or members of that group. Another thing that is talked about in the Establishment Clause is the teaching of evolution. Now, schools cannot teach creation science because it endorses one particular religious doctrine, which would be Christianity. They can teach creation science if they talk about multiple different creation sciences or creation theories. They just cannot only do one. And so that's why evolution is taught, but not necessarily creationary science. Seasonal displays. Having up seasonal displays, especially around Christmas time. You can have a religious display as long as it is not only a religious display. So if you put up the manger scene, you can do that as long as you also have Santa Claus there and snowman, frosted snowman, and a couple reindeer. So as long as it is not just a religious display, you're okay. So that's kind of how that works. So again, you cannot just endorse one religion. So the second part of it is free exercise. And the free exercise clause basically is looking at the question of what is religion? What do we count as religion? And so 1876, we get a case of Davis versus Beeson. And Davis versus Beeson said that, okay, we are going to define religion, and religion is going to be any religion that has a creator. So we will recognize any religion that has a creator in its religion. And that is found to be unconstitutional because not every religion has a creator. And so that will be overturned. So then we get a court case in 1879 called Reynolds versus the United States. And in this one, they come up with, okay, let's have a founding fathers clause. That if this religion was around during the time of the founding fathers, then it's considered a religion. Well, the problem with this is that not every religion was founded during or was around before the time of the founding fathers. For example, the Mormons. And that's why this court case came about, was because it was calling into question the validity of the Mormons because of their polygamist practices. And so they were deliberately trying to exclude Mormons from it, and that was found to be unconstitutional because you're trying to deliberately exclude a group with no, without taking into consideration their rights to exist as a group. So our current standard that we go by today comes from the court case of the U.S. versus Ballard. And this case basically says that we don't take into account the truth of the religion. That doesn't matter to us. Whether or not it actually exists doesn't matter to us. What we do is we define what free exercise is. And free exercise, number one, says that your right to believe in your religion is absolute. Nobody can question your right to believe in your religion. So if you want to create a religion around Kermit the Frog, you sure can. That's not a problem. Kermit the Frog is your creator, or he's the founder of your religion. That's fine. You can believe in it. That's totally acceptable. You have every right to believe in that. The second part of it, however, says that your right to act on your belief in your religion is not absolute. So if your religion based on Kermit the Frog requires human sacrifice of an unwilling virgin or whatever, you can't do that because it infringes upon the rights of another. And so you're not allowed to do that. You can believe in it all you want. You can want to do it all you want. You just can't do it. So I think that helps to make the distinction that it's okay to believe, but it's not okay to act upon those beliefs, especially if it infringes upon somebody else's rights. So that's going to be challenged in the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993. Ultimately, what this said is that the state goals are not taken into consideration for individuals. That if the state has a goal of preventing drug abuse, but an individual's religion calls for the use of marijuana, we don't have to take into consideration the state goals because it's an individual need. So it's a person-by-person basis. Now, this is good. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act is great because all religious groups like it. They're like, oh, yeah, sure. You know, we don't have to follow the state goal because you're going to look at me as a person and look at my religious beliefs and take those into consideration above what the state goals are. But it's bad because tons of prisoners around the country are going to begin demanding different things in the name of their religion. That, oh, I'm a Rastafarian now, and so I need to do some marijuana. You have to provide that for me because it's part of my religious beliefs, so you need to do that. Or I'm a Native American who believes in the use of peyote, or whatever. So all of these court cases come about. In fact, there's like 130 plus lawsuits just in the first few months because these prisoners are taking advantage of this new act. Well, so that kind of throws up a red flag. Okay, is this thing constitutional? Can we do this? And what the Supreme Court came to the decision was that no, it's not constitutional. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act is not constitutional because President and Congress overruled the Supreme Court, which they can do that as long as they are passing like a constitutional amendment. If they change the Constitution, if they add an amendment that changes the Constitution, then they can overrule the Supreme Court, because then the Supreme Court has to follow the Constitution. But the federal government cannot override the state government in this. That's not allowed, because there's no constitutional amendment that allows that to happen. And so it's found to be unconstitutional. Well, nobody actually challenges it. You have to have a court case that comes up that challenges it. And so the challenge comes with the 1996 case of the city of Bourne, Texas versus Flory. Now, what was happening in this is the city of Bourne, Texas wanted to preserve one of its historical landmarks, and Flory was the leader of a church. And the church and the church officials wanted to tear down this historic church and build a new one because they couldn't fit all their parishioners into it. Well, the city isn't going to let them do that because they had applied for and been approved for their church becoming a historical landmark, which puts it into state control, not private control. And so they take them to court over it. The church officials take them to court over it, saying, we need to tear it down so we can fit our parishioners into our building. And the city wins because private individuals do not take precedence over state government. The city law overrides free exercise. And so from this case, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act is going to be found unconstitutional because federal government was superseding state power, and they can't do that. And state power was superseding individuals in the city of Bourne, Texas versus Flory, which is possible. And so that was constitutional. So kind of confusing, but that's how it all comes down. Every so often, Congress screws up and passes things that are unconstitutional. So that's the freedom of religion in the First Amendment. Next thing we're going to look at is the freedom of speech. And the freedom of speech, there are 4 things that are not protected by the freedom of speech. The first is obscenity. And obscenity is different things. We've got different standards that we've looked at. The first rule was the Hicklin rule, and the Hicklin rule said that things could be considered obscene if it met 3 criteria. The first was that it would corrupt the morals of a child. The second was that it was a national standard, that everybody everywhere in the U.S. agreed that this was obscene. And the third was that the material did not have to be judged as a whole. So if it just was a part of it and people considered it obscene and it corrupted the morals of a child, then it was considered obscene and you could be fined or put in jail or whatever the punishment was. Well, that's going to cause a problem because things like the encyclopedia in it has an entire physical male and human body, or male and female body, that are naked, that show internal organs and show the skin structure and the bone structure and all that kind of stuff. But according to the Hicklin rule, that was obscene. It could corrupt the morals of a child who maybe had never seen a naked body before. It was a national standard that children should not be seeing naked bodies. That was considered wrong. And the third was that you weren't taking it as a whole. You're looking at the one thing, the picture, not seeing that, or not taking into consideration that it was part of science and its reality. So that was considered an obscene thing. So that is going to be challenged in the case of Miller versus California in 1973, and that's going to establish the Miller Standard. Now, the Miller Standard says that the average person applying contemporary standards, so today's standards, would find the work taken as a whole, so the whole thing, applies only to prurient or excessively sexual interests. So if you're looking at the encyclopedia and you're looking at it and you're taking it as a whole by today's standards, are you going to be looking at it and say that's obscene? Well, no. So it rules that out. The second part of it says that the work must lack serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. So again, looking at the encyclopedia, it has obviously scientific value. So it's not lacking that. And letter C, the standards are set locally, because what is considered obscene in Iowa may not be considered obscene in New York City or in California, or places where people are a little more liberal or lenient that way. So a good example of things that fall in this that would be obscene is that you can't prohibit live entertainment like strippers. You can't prohibit that from existing, but you can limit where it's located. So you can limit it to within 1,000 feet of residential areas or school areas or park or church areas. You can prohibit child pornography because, that work taken as a whole has no artistic, literary, scientific, or political value. Everyone would agree that it's excessively sexual without any purpose, so that kind of thing. The second thing that is prohibited under freedom of speech is something called libel, and libel is the false and malicious use of printed words. So if you are writing something that is untrue about somebody and it hurts their reputation or damages them, they lose business because of it, you can get in trouble for that. You can get sued. The third is slander, and slander is the false and malicious use of spoken words. So it's the same kind of thing, it's just you speaking it, so something that would damage somebody's reputation or hurt them economically. You can be sued for that. The fourth thing is fighting words, and fighting words are if the words would lead a reasonable person to act violently. So somebody who's sane and normal would react violently or act violently because of what you said. These are words that can incite violence, and so those are prohibited. Now, there's 3 different standards that fall under that. The first is the clear and present danger standard, and this comes from the case of Schenck versus the U.S. in 1914. And Schenck was a German American who believed that the U.S. should not be involved in World War I, that we didn't need to be involved in that, and so he's going to pass out leaflets, and that had violated the Espionage Act. He wasn't supposed to do that. He wasn't supposed to talk against the American government. It felt that would put the U.S. in danger. And so he'll be arrested for endangering. There's a clear and present danger to the U.S. at that time. In 1919, it'll be tweaked a little bit. They change it a little bit, and it will be interpreted to mean leading to danger to society. And so a great example would be screaming fire in a crowded room when there's no fire, and it causes a panic and people get trampled. That is clear and present danger. You're putting society in a clear and present danger to themselves, that somebody's going to get hurt. The second standard is the bad tendency standard, and this comes from Dennis versus the U.S. in 1951. And Dennis was a Communist Party member who was giving speeches that was talking about having a revolution against the government, overthrowing the government. And so from this we get the bad tendency standard, which basically says that if there's a tendency for something bad to happen as a result of your talking, then it's not allowed. And it tends to favor the government. A lot of the time it favors the government. But basically it's if something bad has a tendency to happen because you're saying we should overthrow the government, we should go get them, that's going to not be allowed to happen. The third thing is the preferred position standard. And this comes from Brandenburg versus Ohio in 1969. And Brandenburg was arrested for saying it's time to get revenge on the president and Congress. And it came across as meaning it's time to go kill them. So the preferred positions means that if you're in a preferred position, in a position of power, like the president or senators or representatives or governors, people who are in political positions of power, you get preferred status, that you get extra protection. And so it makes a distinction between the advocacy of ideas that we need to change things versus the advocacy of illegal action. We need to change things by killing people. So there's a huge distinction there. So if you're talking about changing things, that's one thing. But if you're talking about changing things by getting rid of them, by offing them, that's a whole different thing that you're dealing with. So that's the distinction there, the preferred position standard. All right, the last thing we're going to talk about with the First Amendment is the freedom of press. And freedom of press has a lot of things going with that too. And a lot of it deals with like freedom of speech, being able to say or write what you want with the freedom of the press. Freedom of the press has prior restraint. And prior restraint basically means that the government cannot review material for the purpose of determining if it can be published or not. So the government can't go into newspapers and magazines and say, hey, what are you writing for tomorrow? Oh, I don't like this, I don't like this, I don't like this. You can't write that. They can't do that. So it's part of that freedom of expression kind of thing, that we're able to read things even if the government doesn't agree with it. So Neer versus Minnesota is a case in 1931 which prohibits censorship, with the exception if it is something that is in regards to war, or if it is considered obscene, or if it helps to protect against violence. Those things can be censored. The New York Times versus the United States in 1971, 40 years later, is going to kind of come up about this and challenge the Neer versus Minnesota decision. And this was the time of the Vietnam War, and a document called the Pentagon Papers is going to be leaked to the press. There were 15 copies of it that were meant to be for the military commanders, and it explains why the U.S. was fighting in Vietnam. And what it was doing is it showed a discrepancy between what was actually happening and what the government was telling people. So it's going to expose a huge network of lies. And so someone gets a hold of one of these copies and they send it, I can't talk English today, they send it to the Times, to the New York Times. And Nixon finds out about it, President Nixon finds out about it, and he says, you can't print that because you're going to put troops in harm's way and all this kind of stuff, that for war purposes, like in Neer versus Minnesota said, for war purposes, you can't print this, you can censor it. He said, for war purposes, you can't print this stuff. And the New York Times is going to take it to court, and the Supreme Court is going to side with the New York Times, because basically the government can censor it, but only if it puts troops in harm's way. And nothing in the document would put troops in harm's way. It was politically embarrassing, yes, but it was not something that was going to endanger our troops. So it sides with the New York Times, and it's allowed to be published. So our next video, we're going to look at more civil liberties, but more in protecting individual freedoms that come with the rest of the 10 amendments and so forth.